Welcome, friends, to the next part in my series on posthuman transformation in ancient Mediterranean thought, becoming angels and demons. This is chapter 4 of my book, Posthuman Transformation, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. I offer this as a teaser introduction to those wanting to go through the book either before or after purchase as a kind of introduction. Of course, for the full detail and all the footnotes and references, please check out the book itself. I hope that this is of value to you, and without further ado, let's begin. Chapter 4 is called Daimonification in Xenocrates, Plutarch, Apuleius, and Maximus of Tyre. It continues the story of chapter 3, where I looked at daimonification in Plato, specifically his dialogues, the Timaeus and Cratylus and Republic and Phaedrus, as well as the Symposium. So if you haven't seen that video, go back to that. You can also check out the introduction and chapters 1 to 2, also freely available here. So let me tell you about the thesis of this chapter. Plato experimented himself with multiple modes of talking about daimonification depending on which dialogue he was talking in, but he never gave a comprehensive picture of what really happened to the soul after its release from the body, whether the soul was somehow identified with the daimon, its higher consciousness, or whether part of the soul died and another part rose to the stars. Plato never really talked about the life of the daimon in the mediating region of the air and graduating to higher and higher stages of life. All of this was left to later Platonists who experimented much in the same way that Plato did, that is, through myth-making practices and myth-making specifically about the afterlife, filling in those details of the soul's moral journey through more likely stories. And they told, or finished rather, the story in such a way that they also, in many respects, were able to connect up Platonic daimonology with more popular understandings of demones in the popular religious sphere. The name Xenocrates is perhaps not that well known today. Xenocrates was the third head of Plato's academy from 339 to 314 BCE. He was from Chalcedon in modern Turkey, across the straits from what is now Istanbul. And he had distinctly Pythagorean leanings and was one of those Platonists who helped to form what became known as Neo-Pythagoreanism, that complex mixture and synthesis of Platonic and Pythagorean thought. There's only, unfortunately, fragments of Xenocrates' work left, but in these fragments, he tells us, perhaps in his book called On the Gods, that all souls, when released from the body, become demones. And that means that souls who are good become demones, and souls who are bad also become demones. Now, this was something that Plato himself never allowed, but it allowed Xenocrates to explain why in popular religious discourse there were so many bad demones that haunted people and played tricks on people and inflicted disease. And troubled the human race. Xenocrates could now explain that these demones were actually bad human souls, by which he meant human souls not properly in control of their emotions and dominated by desires, jealousies, wrath, and anger. These are the, to put it in modern terms, the ghosts that haunt both people and places. The ideal situation is that a daimon, when released from the body, although not fully divorced from the desires for material joys and enjoyments, is still on its way toward progressing toward the good. And Xenocrates fully agreed with Plato that the goal was more and more to be assimilated to a higher kind of life, divorced from the passions and in a super heavenly sphere. But he gave much more thought to how daimones go from A to B, so to speak, from earthly life to the super heavenly life. It wasn't just the snap of a fingers, it was a long process of purgation in the air. And our moral training does not end with life in flesh. In fact, it's just beginning. Plutarch is a better known name. He is contemporary with the gospel writers in the very late, early 2nd century. And like Plato, he spoke his philosophy in dialogues, many of which survive complete. We are very grateful for that. And in these dialogues, he spoke in a sort of cautious way about what might happen after death, often showing and very conscious of the fact that he was speaking only what we would call speculative kinds of theories that he often put in the mouth of foreign sages, great travelers who heard oracles and saw visions at the ends of the earth, and then came back and reported what it is that they heard and saw. And I discussed 3 dialogues in the book. The first one being the decline of oracles, the second, the daimonion of Socrates, and the third, called the face in the moon. And I won't parse out exactly what is in each of the 3 dialogues. For that, please go see the book. In the interest of time, I will just say a couple points here. First of all, that Plutarch gives us what seems to be our first clear written demonstration of a hierarchy of beings that run from humans to heroes to demones to gods, and that as one makes a moral progression, whether in earth or in the air after death, one goes through these stages. So the stage of being a human and having a human soul who is exceptionally virtuous becomes a hero soul who is exceptionally virtuous becomes a daemon, and a daemon who is exceptionally virtuous becomes a god. Now this is an interesting progression, because I think that it allows Plutarch to explain why some heroes are depicted as dangerous and bad, because they haven't fully morally progressed. Demones are all good, and Plutarch's example of a person becoming a daemon is Romulus in his Life of Romulus, and his example of a person becoming a god is Isis and Osiris, the great Egyptian heroes who went from hero to demon to god. And it also allows Plutarch to explain the phenomena in popular religion, why some figures like Heracles are worshipped both as a hero and as a god, because their worship was established at two different phases of their moral and ontological evolution. And the home base for Demones in Xenocrates was the moon, but Plutarch developed this idea a bit further, saying that the soul underwent two deaths. First was the removal or separation of the soul from the flesh, which moved the soul from Earth to the moon. And the second death, which happened on Hecate's recess in the moon, was the separation of the nous, or mind or consciousness, from the soul. And the nous then went to dwell as a pure being in the sun, which, since Plato, had always been a representation of the intelligible world. Then there is Apuleius, the North African, who flourished in the mid-2nd century of the Common Era, a bit after Plutarch, comes specifically from what is now Algeria. And there's a lot to say about Apuleius, but again, I will boil it down here. Basically, Apuleius seems to have been the first to give us three specific categories of demones, by which he included demones as souls who are in bodies, spoken of in Plato's Timaeus, souls who are outside of bodies, and souls who are never embodied. These would be the very pure souls who never feel any attraction or desire for material things. Now, the souls outside of bodies, Apuleius tried to identify with those figures more known among Latin-speaking peoples as daemones, that is the ghost gods, basically those blessed dead who had departed, some of whom became guardians of the household, also known in the Roman world as lares. Some became lemures, which are sort of good ghosts, and a few became larvae, which are bad ghosts. I'm grossly simplifying this, but again, we see that this Platonist too wants to say that souls are at different stages of moral evolution, which explains why they behave in certain ways after they leave the flesh. Apuleius also tried to identify what the Romans called the genius with Plato's internal daimon, again spoken of in the Timaeus. And the genius was that second higher self for the Romans, often localized in the forehead. So here we see Apuleius striving hard to synthesize Platonic philosophy with the more popular afterlife figures known in, or I should say, superhuman figures known in Roman lore. And finally, there is Maximus of Tyre, who flourished in the late 2nd century of the Common Era in the reign of the Emperor Commodus. Maximus of Tyre was apparently a popular teacher who traveled to Rome and gave a series of lectures, many of which survive. In these lectures, he repeated for a popular audience much of Platonic lore, but added bits and pieces of his own creative synthesis. And part of that creative synthesis was that demones have distinct occupations. Maximus agreed with the stricter Platonists that demones are high-ranking enough to be solely good, and he agreed that they dwell in the air and that they are mediating beings. But he emphasized that as they take on their role as guardians and helpers, that they have distinct occupations and dispositions. So he mentions the fact that Asclepius heals, Heracles strengthens, and the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, set sail, and that the loves that they had in life, they also have after life. That is, after their life in the flesh. And this explains why certain gods in the Greco-Roman world had certain specialties. Now, what's interesting here is that Maximus is comfortable referring to these Greco-Roman deities as demones, which is also how Christians of the time like to refer to these beings. But of course, for Christians like Justin Martyr and Tatian, the demones were entirely evil. And so it's better to translate them as out and out demons. But we can see that there was a kind of confluence of discourse, even though the values of the Christians were transvalued. They were trying to speak in philosophical terms, but the words that they used often had different meanings. And that is it. I only intended to give a very short summary of this chapter, and I encourage everyone to dive into the real meat of the book if they can get a hold of it. Again, it's Posthuman Transformation in Ancient Mediterranean Thought, Cambridge University Press, 2021. I'll put a link of my author page on Amazon in the description. For now, I just want to thank everybody for coming along. These videos are made available to you, and they take work. So if you want to support me further, I would really appreciate it. Leave a like and a comment, and I hope you sincerely consider purchasing the book. Until we meet again, take care.